Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating dual history. We often hear the phrase, you are what you eat, but what about what you read? We're going to uncover how American identity has been shaped across 5 centuries by looking closely at 2 powerful cultural mirrors, what was sitting on the dinner table right alongside what was sitting on the bookshelf. Let's dive in. To wrap our heads around this massive, continent-spanning history, we're going to use a side-by-side chronological approach. We'll track these 2 pillars of culture through 5 distinct eras, starting with Native American origins, moving through colonial survival, independence in the frontier, the industrial era, and finally into our modern experience. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the roots of American culture and Native American origins pre-1600s. So diving into the pre-1600s, Native American populations lived in deep, sustained connection with their incredibly diverse bioregions. They really established the foundational roots of this continent, cultivating sophisticated foodways and rich oral literary traditions that varied wildly depending on their geography and immediate environment.
It's amazing to see the interplay here between survival and storytelling. Tribes adapted seamlessly to their surroundings. Out east, you had the Wabanaki hunting moose in dense forests. Meanwhile, other tribes were practicing Three Sisters agriculture, which is the genius companion planting of corn, beans, and squash. At the exact same time, they were developing rich oral creation myths. They'd use culturally significant repeating numbers, like 4, to represent the cardinal directions, or 7, to include skyward, earthward, and center. They were literally passing down deep cultural meaning across generations.
I mean, just imagine trying to boil water without a fire-safe pot. How do you do it? Well, early tribes solved this with an ingenious method called stone boiling. They would heat rocks directly in a roaring fire, and then literally drop those blazing hot rocks straight into wooden or woven containers of water to bring it to a boil. That's how they cooked their hard-earned game and root vegetables. It was highly practical, entirely rooted in the natural materials they had, and incredibly clever. Moving right along to Section 2, Colonial Survival and Faith, covering the 1600s to the 1700s.
During this era, European settlers arriving on the eastern seaboard were hit with the harsh realities of the New World. They brought over all their rigid culinary biases and deep religious divisions from Europe, which forced a rapid and, let's be honest, sometimes pretty painful adaptation to North America's resources. At first, colonists desperately tried to replicate the European diets, but crops like wheat were just incredibly hard to grow here. Still, there was a fierce resistance to outside influence. This is perfectly captured by English cookbook author Hannah Glass's hilarious disdain for French cuisine. She literally complains about the blind folly of preferring a French booby over a good English cook. These colonists vastly preferred their familiar mutton, pork fat, and traditional stews over any fancy continental European trends.
But here's the thing. While they stubbornly clung to their tastes, basic physical survival meant they had to adopt native techniques. Enter the New England clam bake, layering hot stones, seaweed, fresh seafood, and eventually potatoes. So their diets were unifying around pure survival, but their literature, that reflected deep, bitter colonial divides. You had these ultra-strict, heavy Puritan texts on one side, clashing directly with works like Thomas Morton's New English Canaan. That book was a harsh, anti-religious pushback against puritanical customs and power structures. Total culture clash.
Which brings us to Section 3, Independence, the Frontier, and Romanticism in the 1800s.
By the 1800s, America was expanding westward, fostering this intense culture of rugged self-sufficiency. This 19th century era was truly defined by the isolation and backbreaking physical labor of the American farmhouse. But what's so fascinating is that it occurred at the exact same time that the soaring, highly optimistic literary movements of Romanticism and Transcendentalism were taking flight. Just look at this incredible parallel. On one hand, you have daily, physical self-sufficiency. Farm families are spending their Octobers churning their own apple butter, baking rhubarb pie in the spring, making buckwheat cakes in the winter. And on the other hand, you've got writers like Henry David Thoreau championing spiritual and intellectual self-reliance and the inherent goodness of the natural world in works like Walden. The physical diet of the farm perfectly mirrored the intellectual diet of the Transcendentalists. It's like a matching set. But there was absolutely a dark side to this frontier expansion. Just like how we use horror movies to process our anxieties today, the 1800s gave rise to American Gothic literature. Authors like Washington Irving channeled the deep anxieties, the extreme isolation, and the very real fear of the unknown wilderness to explore dark themes. It served as a much darker, spookier counterpoint to all that sunny transcendentalist optimism.
Okay, moving into Section 4, Realism, Industry, and War, spanning the late 1800s to the 1940s. So,
The brutal reality of the Civil War and eventually World War I completely shattered those earlier romantic illusions. Between the 1860s and 1940s, America rapidly traded the self-sufficient rural farmhouse for the cramped urban kitchenette. And at the exact same time, authors completely ditched romanticism for stark, unvarnished realism. Think about all those food safety labels you rely on today. Well, they started right here out of sheer necessity. In these rapidly expanding, crowded cities, muckraking journalists started exposing dangerously adulterated, industrialized foods. This led a chemist named Harvey Washington Wiley to run pure food tests, fighting back against these toxic products. His crusade actually led directly to the creation of the FDA in 1906. Because of that, urban consumers could finally survive on safer staples like pasteurized milk in glass bottles and bread fortified with synthetic vitamins.
And here's where it ties together again. Just as urbanites were now eating highly standardized, practical meals, we're talking tomato bisques straight from a tin can or cold cuts from a deli, writers were standardizing their view of the world too. Literary realism and naturalism emerged. Heavyweights like Mark Twain and Stephen Crane stripped away all the romantic fluff to present raw, deeply skeptical realities without any supernatural elements. Think of Crane's short story The Open Boat, which depicts an entirely indifferent universe. It perfectly matched the cold, mechanical reality of this massive, new industrialized food system.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the modern American experience, from the 1950s up to the present day.
Following World War II, a massive wave of prosperity, new convenience technologies, and shifting cultural norms completely redefined the dinner table and the literary landscape all over again. We see the absolute explosion of modern convenience foods happening right alongside the rise of highly subversive, postmodern literature.
It is the ultimate modern juxtaposition. Take the TV dinner, for example. It's a multi-course meal assembled in a factory, flash-frozen in aluminum packaging, and meant to be eaten mindlessly in front of a glowing screen. It is peak process convenience. And reacting to this exact mass-produced culture was postmodern literature. Writers really started pushing boundaries, using fragmented narratives, temporal distortion, and unreliable narrators to question objective reality itself. They were critiquing culture and exploring a deeply pluralistic society, pushing back against that cookie-cutter TV dinner lifestyle.
As you've seen, throughout history, the way we nourish our bodies and the way we nourish our minds have been intimately, inextricably connected. They brilliantly mirror the struggles, the environments, and the successes of the human experience, which leaves us with one pretty provocative question to ponder. As we continue hurtling into an era of instant digital feeds and drive-through fast food, what will tomorrow's historians conclude about who we are right now? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring.